The first thing I remember is the color red against the ice. A torn jacket sleeve fluttering in wind so cold it sounded like glass breaking. The ranger who found it said it caught the light just once, like a flare before dusk, before the glacier swallowed the color again. That sight still wakes me some nights. It's how we first knew the mountain had finally given something back. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. When I think of James and Emily, I don't picture Everest right away. I picture our town, Golden, Colorado, on a Saturday morning, the smell of roasted coffee spilling out of Miner's Cup Cafe sunlight bouncing off truck windshields parked along Washington Avenue. That's where I saw them most weekends, sitting by the window with a map spread out between their mugs, arguing softly about routes or camp menus. James always carried a pencil behind his ear. Emily always had a camera strap looped around her wrist, even indoors. They fit together in that easy way people do when they've learned to move at the same rhythm. Back then, my life had slowed to quieter things. I'd left the fire service after 26 years, traded sirens for the hum of morning sprinklers and the steady shuffle of my dog across the porch. I'd taken to hiking the lower trails just to keep my lungs honest, and every so often James would tag along his pack twice the size of mine, his steps deliberate but light. He'd talk about oxygen levels the way other men talk about baseball scores, always measuring planning. Emily joined us a few times. She'd lag behind to take photos of frost catching sunlight on the grass. It's never just white, she'd say, crouching to frame a shot. There's blue in it and gray and sometimes pink if you look close enough. She had a way of finding color where the rest of us only saw cold. They were saving for something big, we all knew that. The talk of Everest started as a dream shared in passing after one of their climbs in Utah. Then, slowly, it became a plan. Training schedules taped to their fridge oxygen masks, hanging in their garage evening runs up Lookout Mountain, even when sleet cut sideways across the road. I remember once standing outside their house at dusk, hearing laughter through the open window as Emily timed James doing pull-ups on the doorway beam. "You'll thank me at 28,000 feet, she teased. He shot back, breathless. "Only if we make it to 29. That was them part determination, part tenderness. They weren't reckless, just deeply convinced that love could outlast fatigue and altitude. Their families tried to be supportive. Emily's sister Caroline stopped by my place one afternoon anxious. She'd heard her sister talk about death zones and wind chills that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. "They make it sound poetic," she said, twisting her scarf. "But it scares me." I told her James was cautious that he'd call in from every major camp. And I believe that. In early April of 2003, the last snow fell heavy across the Front Range. The morning they left, I drove them to Denver International. The sunrise was peach-colored behind the control tower, and their luggage looked too light for the kind of danger they were flying toward. Emily hugged me once and said, "If I get the shot I'm hoping for, you'll see it on the cover of National Geographic." James laughed, shaking his head. "She's only half joking." Then they disappeared into the crowd hand in hand. After they left, spring settled in slow. The air-warmed grass thickened along Clear Creek, and folks in town turned their attention to ball games and Sunday fairs. Life was ordinary, the kind that feels indestructible while you're in it. Every few weeks, an email or a satellite call from Kathmandu came through short notes about training treks. The weight of the packs, the kindness of their Sherpa team. Emily described the stars above base camp as so bright they hum. On May 19th, James called my landline from Camp 4. The reception crackled, but I could make out his voice, steady, tired, thrilled. "We're at 26,000, he said. "Tomorrow's our window. Tell everyone we'll see you from the top." It was the last time I heard him laugh. In hindsight, maybe there were hints that the weather was shifting faster than expected. I remember reading a dispatch online from another climbing team describing high winds and a thin veil of cloud forming over the North Core. I thought to myself, James will wait it out. He always waits it out. But the next morning, Caroline called saying she couldn't reach Emily's satellite phone. I told her not to worry sometimes, batteries froze, signals dropped. Still, I kept the radio on that night, listening for any update through the static of global feeds. The days that followed blurred together. Each evening, the sun dipped behind Table Mountain, turning the sky the color of copper, and I'd find myself glancing toward their dark house down the street. The porch light came on automatically at dusk, a tiny glow that stayed burning long after midnight. Neighbors said they'd leave it on until the pair came home. In town, conversation turned quieter whenever their names came up. The barista at Miner's Cup set 2 mugs aside on the shelf, saying she'd keep them there until next season. Caroline started visiting my porch after work, sitting with her hands around a cup of tea she never finished. Maybe the lines froze, she'd whisper. Maybe they turned back. I wanted to believe her. We all did. June rolled into July, and the snowmelt fed the river until it hissed over the rocks like static. Every sound reminded me of wind, the same kind that roared through their phone call weeks earlier. I caught myself checking the weather reports for the Himalayas, trying to make sense of pressure charts I barely understood. Each day ended with the same ritual porch light on radio low, waiting for news that never came. Sometimes I'd drive up to Lookout Point just to see the night stretch over the valley. From there, Golden looked small, fragile, even tiny clusters of light surrounded by dark. I'd think about James and Emily high above the world, somewhere between cloud and snow, their own headlamps cutting through the storm. It felt impossible that 2 people who had prepared so completely could simply vanish into silence. By August, the climbing season had closed. Flights returned from Nepal carrying weathered teams and crates of gear. Their expedition leader sent a short note saying the mountain had turned violent whiteouts. Avalanches, temperatures that could strip warmth in seconds. He wrote that search efforts would continue as soon as it was safe. That letter sat folded on my kitchen table for weeks, edges softening with time. Life kept moving because it had to. Carolyn went back to teaching. I returned to my volunteer shifts at the firehouse, though every siren made my stomach knot. I'd stand by the bay door at dusk, watching snow flurries drift in the light and thinking how small and fragile the world looked from down here. Then one evening in November, as the first real winter wind pressed against the windows, I walked past their house again. The porch light still burned faint behind the frost. I noticed a single envelope tucked in the screen door, postmarked from Nepal, smudged but legible. My hands shook when I pulled it free. Inside was a short note from a Sherpa named Tenzing Dorje, the same man who'd guided them up the mountain. His handwriting slanted as though hurried by cold. They went on. I had to turn back. I pray they are with the sky. I read those lines under the street lamp until the ink blurred. Around me, the neighborhood was still the only sound, the creak of the wind through bare branches. That was the moment I realized peace in our little town had shifted, maybe for good. Something vast and silent had moved between us and the world above. That night, I left the porch light burning too. It was sometime after Thanksgiving when the world seemed to move slower, and yet my thoughts never stopped racing. Every evening, I'd walk past James and Emily's house, that same porch light still burning against the cold, like a promise someone forgot to take back. Neighbors had started avoiding the subject. Their names were spoken in lowered voices, as if the wind itself might carry bad luck. I tried not to let my mind wander, but it always did upward across the miles and the altitude toward a white emptiness, where the air thins and sound dies in your throat. I kept thinking maybe they're still up there waiting for a break in the weather. By February, it was clear that hope had started to fade, though no one said it out loud. Caroline stopped by less often. When she did, she looked smaller somehow, wrapped in her wool coat like she was trying to disappear inside it. Once she handed me a clipping from a Nepalese paper translated online, a short article about another expedition that had turned back from the summit. She'd circled a single line in red pen visibility, dropped to 0 winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Underneath, she'd written May 20th, 2003, the date their signal went dead. She didn't have to say what she was thinking. That kind of storm doesn't forgive mistakes. Still, part of me refused to believe it. I'd seen too many rescues that looked impossible until the moment they weren't. I told myself that maybe they'd taken shelter somewhere, an ice cave, a tent buried under snow. Maybe they were waiting for a clearing to descend. You can tell yourself anything when the alternative feels too final. When spring came again, the news reached us by accident. A climber from another team had spotted a patch of bright fabric half buried near the North Car. It wasn't identified, but word spread fast. Everyone hoped it belonged to someone else. The Whitakers had been missing almost 2 years by then, but in our town, no one really said gone. We said up there. It was easier that way. In May of 2005, I was working with a volunteer search unit outside of Estes Park when a call came through from Nepal. It was short, almost clinical. A body had been found on Everest, near where James and Emily were last seen. I remember sitting in my truck for a long time after I hung up the world suddenly too quiet. The sound of the wind in the pines reminded me of static over the phone, the same thin, breaking sound I'd heard the night James called from Camp 4. Days later, we got the confirmation. The Rangers had recovered remains that matched James. His identification papers were still sealed inside a waterproof pouch against his chest. I couldn't stop thinking about that, how deliberate it was, how prepared he'd been right up until the moment the mountain took him. Caroline came by my house when the news broke. She didn't cry at first. She just stood at the kitchen counter holding a photo of the two of them from their last training hike, her thumb pressed against the edge of Emily's smile. "They found his jacket," she said. "They said it was red and black." Then her voice cracked soft as a breath. "He always wore that one." The following week, we learned that something else had been recovered near him, a camera dented and half frozen but intact. It had belonged to Emily. I didn't think much of it at first. Cameras like rings or ropes show up on that mountain all the time. But when the developed film made its way back to the families, everything changed. The first photographs were what you'd expect, wide shots of white peaks, James grinning behind his goggles, Emily posing with a prayer flag flapping behind her. But as the roll went on, the colors dimmed. You could see fatigue creeping in their faces, drawn their movement slower. One frame showed James kneeling to check an oxygen valve, his glove half off skin mottled with frost. Another showed Emily staring toward a wall of cloud rolling up the ridge. You could almost feel the temperature dropping through the picture. The last image froze everyone who saw it. The two of them stood side by side, a storm closing in around them, holding hands through the blur of snow. Their bodies were small, swallowed by white. No summit behind them, no horizon. Just a flat expanse of nothing. When the families invited me to see the photographs, I thought I was ready. I'd seen more death than I cared to remember. Car wrecks, house fires, things that leave scars you don't talk about. But this was different. There was something unbearably human about those pictures, as if the camera itself had tried to keep them from disappearing. The forensic team believed James had collapsed near the ridge from exhaustion and altitude sickness. There were no signs of injury, no struggle, just the slow shutting down of a body running out of air. But Emily's body wasn't there. That part none of us could understand. She'd been tethered to him by rope. They always climbed that way. For her to be gone meant something had broken. In the weeks that followed, rumors grew like frost. Some said she'd tried to descend alone to find help. Others believed she'd stayed beside him until she couldn't stand any longer. I remember Caroline telling a reporter quietly she would never leave him. And I knew she was right. That was the kind of love they had, stubborn, steady, the kind that doesn't let go, even when it should. When I looked at the photograph of them holding hands, I noticed something small. Most people missed a slight bend in the rope near James's hip, like it was pulled taut and then suddenly slack. I didn't mention it to Caroline. It wasn't my place to add another question to her sleepless nights. The ranger who'd found James described it in a brief report how he and his team had noticed a flash of fabric beneath the ice, how careful they'd been not to disturb what was left. He said the arms were folded across the chest as if shielding something. I wondered if in his final moments James had tried to protect that waterproof pouch, the one holding his papers and maybe a letter or photograph. The idea haunted me. Not long after a second search began focused on finding Emily. The weather that summer was brutal with shifting ice and sudden slides. Teams combed through crevasses and ridges near where James had been found, but nothing surfaced. It was as if the mountain had closed its hand again. By August, Caroline stopped answering most calls from journalists. She told me once over coffee that she couldn't stand hearing strangers talk about her sister like a mystery to be solved. Emily wasn't lost, she said quietly. She's just waiting for the right moment to come home. That fall, a small memorial was held at the community church. James's parents brought the flag he used to carry on his climbs. Caroline read a poem Emily had written years before about light and altitude. I sat near the back watching the morning sun filter through the stained glass. It caught the dust in the air, turning it into tiny sparks. For a moment, I imagined that's what the two of them looked like up there, just light caught in motion. After the service, I stood outside with Caroline as the wind picked up, carrying that thin scent of snow that always means winter's coming early. She said the recovery had given her peace, but I could tell it hadn't. It's worse now, she admitted, because knowing he's gone means knowing she probably is too. I didn't have words for that. I just nodded and we stood in silence until the cold made our eyes water. But the story didn't end there. Months later, in the early winter of 2005, Sherpas found a few items lower down the slope, a torn glove, a broken ice axe, and a strand of blonde hair tangled in the snow. DNA confirmed it belonged to Emily. The discovery meant her body was somewhere nearby, carried by the glacier, or buried under new ice. The mountain had given another sign, just enough to remind everyone it wasn't finished speaking. That night I sat in my den with the heater clicking and the wind moaning outside, reading the report under a yellow lamp. I couldn't shake one thought from my head that maybe she'd stayed beside him until the rope broke, and in the chaos she'd slipped not far, but far enough. The camera, her last witness, left behind. For weeks afterward, I found myself walking at night again. The air in Colorado gets razor sharp in December, cold enough to make every breath sound like it's freezing on the way out. I'd walk to the end of the street and back past their darkened house, the porch light finally turned off now that James had been brought home. Yet sometimes when the moon hit the snow just right, it felt like that light was still there, burning steady through the glass. Even as the town settled back into its quiet rhythm, I knew the story wasn't over. Caroline once said she'd never stop searching even if it meant waiting years. And I believed her. Because if there's one thing stronger than the mountain's silence, it's the kind of love that refuses to accept it. The last time I spoke with her that year, she mentioned a rumor a team of climbers from New Zealand planning to return to the North Pole the following spring. They'd agreed to keep an eye out near the same ridge where James had been found. "Maybe the ice will move," she said. "Maybe it'll show us something new." Her voice was calm when she said it, but her hands trembled as she poured her tea. I didn't say what I was thinking, that mountains don't give back easily, and when they do, it's rarely the whole truth. Still, when I looked out the window that night, the sky over the foothills was clear, the stars sharp enough to hurt your eyes. Somewhere out there, above all that cold and cloud, lay the ridge where they made their last stand against the wind. And for the first time I realized that maybe what Caroline meant wasn't about finding Emily's body. Maybe it was about finding her peace. That's how the winter of 2005 ended for us. Quiet streets, long nights, and the faint, stubborn hope that the mountain might still have one more secret left to share. The winter that followed was long and dry, the kind where the cold doesn't bite so much as settle in and stay. I remember watching the foothills turn from white to dull brown by February of 2006, each week quieter than the last. Around town, people had stopped mentioning James and Emily out loud. Their names had become a kind of shared silence, something you didn't say unless you had to. But in my mind, the mountain never stopped talking. Every time I looked toward the horizon, I imagined that same ridge where the storm swallowed them. I couldn't stop thinking about how it must have looked from up there, how small the world below must have seemed. Caroline and I stayed in touch through short phone calls and late letters that arrived smelling faintly of her classroom chalk paper, that old radiator heat. She'd started volunteering with a mountaineering group that tracked weather conditions on Himalayan routes. She told me it was her way of keeping close to Emily to understand what had taken her. Once she said, "I just want to know if anyone saw them before or after." It was a simple wish, but it carried the kind of weight only waiting can give. That spring, reports trickled out through the climbing community, small hushed things that rarely made the news. One expedition leader claimed he'd found a rope buried in the ice a few hundred feet from where James was recovered. Another said he'd seen signs that a body had been exposed earlier and recovered by snowfall. Each story came from a different corner, told by men and women who had no reason to lie, but who also didn't want to get involved. On Everest, rumors blow harder than wind, and truth freezes just as quickly. In May, Caroline sent me a clipping from a Kathmandu paper. It mentioned that park officials were reviewing recovery procedures after reports of delayed notifications to families of foreign climbers. The article didn't name names, but I could tell what it was about. Someone had seen something up there earlier, maybe James's body, maybe even both of them, and said nothing. The idea that their families could have had closure years sooner burned in a quiet, steady way. I kept rereading the line about delayed notification, thinking how easily bureaucracy can stretch grief into eternity. That summer, I visited Caroline in Denver. She'd kept Emily's photographs in a small wooden box on her coffee table, prints from the recovered film, plus a few developed after the originals were digitized. I hadn't seen them since that first viewing, but this time I noticed new details. In one frame, Emily's scarf had been pulled up over her mouth, her eyes half closed against the wind. Behind her, faint and distant, was a ridgeline blurred by what looked like moving snow. Caroline pointed at it and said softly, "That's the storm they walked into." Then she asked, "Do you think someone found them back then?" Before the ranger did, I told her I didn't know. But deep down, I think I did. The mountain isn't a secret, it's a witness. It holds everything, and every so often it lets something go. By fall, an investigation began quietly among Nepalese authorities and a few international climbing groups. They wanted to understand whether earlier expeditions might have encountered the Whitakers and chosen silence. I read about it through online forums and emailed dispatches, nothing official, just fragments. One thread mentioned that the waterproof pouch found on James's body had been recently disturbed. That phrasing stayed with me. Disturbed. It suggested a human hand, not a shift of ice. One night in September, Caroline called me out of nowhere. Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and exhaustion. "If they knew," she said, "and they didn't tell anyone, that's 2 years of my life spent praying for ghosts." I didn't know how to answer. There's a kind of pain that doesn't want comfort, it just wants to be understood. The following year brought more climbs, more summits, more tragedies. Everest doesn't pause for the dead. Among climbers, stories of James's resting place began to circulate. They said his body was visible from a section of the northern route, frozen in a crouched position, arms folded like he was sleeping. Some called him the guardian. It wasn't disrespectful, more like a quiet reverence. On mountains like that, the line between myth and memory blurs fast. People need something to believe in, even if it's just a figure watching over them from the ice. I remember the first photograph that reached the press. It wasn't meant for publication, just a candid shot taken by a climber passing through. You could see the red and black jacket, the frost crusted around the shoulders, the rope trailing like a ribbon half buried in snow. The image circulated online before being taken down, but not before Caroline saw it. She called me that night, her voice hollow. "He's still up there," she whispered. "Even now." I tried to remind her that Everest moves constantly, that ice shifts and reclaims what it shows. But she was right, the mountain holds on, sometimes for decades. And if you stand close enough, you can almost believe the frozen stillness is just someone catching their breath. In early 2007, I started hearing from a climber I'd met years earlier, a man named Peter Callahan, a geologist from Oregon who'd summited 3 times. He was leading a New Zealand team preparing for another northern ascent. He remembered James and Emily's case, said it had changed how he thought about risk. One evening, over a bad connection, he told me they were planning to search the area again, unofficially. The glaciers receded about 20 feet since '05, he said. If she's nearby, this might be the year. I could hear wind howling behind his voice, even through the line. I wished him luck and asked him to be careful. He just said, "No one ever is Sam. We just try to act like it." Caroline didn't know about Peter's plan until I mentioned it weeks later. Her eyes filled, but she didn't smile. If he finds her, she said, I want to be the one to bring her home. By late spring, Everest season was underway again. Reports came through daily summits, rescues, injuries. I found myself scanning headlines at breakfast, half hoping and half dreading. Then, on an early May morning, the phone rang. It was Peter's voice, rough with altitude. "Sam," he said, pausing to breathe. We found her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. All I could hear was the static and the slow hum of wind in his headset. Finally, he said, "She's not far from where James was. 200 feet, maybe. Still tethered." His voice broke on that last word. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up over the ridge. Outside, the air was clear and still. Somewhere halfway across the world, the mountain had opened its hand. It took another day for news to reach the families officially. The rangers confirmed the find, a blue down jacket, the remains inside, curled to one side, a rope fragment still clutched in her frozen hand. DNA tests later made it certain it was Emily. Caroline flew to Nepal within the week. Before she left, she stopped by my house wearing that same wool coat she'd worn the winter they vanished. She said quietly, "He promised he'd never let go. And now I know he didn't." I watched her car disappear down the street, the early morning light catching the frost on her windshield. There was nothing left to say. In the days that followed, I read every report that came out of the Himalayas. The recovery had been careful, deliberate. The team found her just beneath a thin layer of ice, her hand still holding the snapped rope. Near her body, they discovered a small notebook wrapped in plastic. The pages were damaged, but one entry remained legible, written in pencil words, pressed hard as though against shaking fingers. "Storm too strong. James weak. We stay together always." Those 7 words made every headline in the world. And yet for those of us who knew them, it wasn't news. It was confirmation of what we'd always known. That they faced it together. That love in its purest form sometimes chooses not to survive alone. When Caroline returned from Nepal, she brought with her a small tin of soil taken from near where they'd been found. She said it was for their graves back home. During the service that fall, she poured it over the pair of headstones set side by side, her hand trembling but steady enough to finish. The mountains around Golden turned red and gold that afternoon, the air cool enough to sting. As the crowd thinned, I stayed behind, watching the wind catch the edge of the white cloth draped across the memorial. It fluttered once like a flag, then settled flat again. In that moment, I thought about how the world gives us closure, but never peace. Because even now, with both of them home, there were still questions left buried in the ice, like whether someone really had found them earlier, or if the mountain itself had kept them hidden until it was ready. I don't think we'll ever know. That night, Caroline called me one last time before turning in. "They're together now," she said softly. "And that's all that matters." But after we hung up, I stood at the window for a long time watching the clouds move slow across the moon. Somewhere far beyond that silver light was Everest, cold, patient, eternal, and I had the uneasy feeling that it wasn't finished with their story yet. When Caroline came home from Nepal, she didn't speak much about what she saw. There was a stillness in her that hadn't been there before, like the mountain had taken something out of her and refused to give it back. She moved slower, talked softer. When I met her at the airport that September, she carried a small metal urn in her bag wrapped in a wool scarf. She told me one half was for James, the other for Emily. "They'll rest side by side," she said, and that was all. No tears, no trembling, just a calm that felt like exhaustion. I drove her home through the foothills that evening, the sun hanging low and red behind the peaks. The air had that faint metallic chill that always means the first frost isn't far away. She leaned her forehead against the window, watching the ridgeline fade. "You know," she said almost to herself, "up there they're still together. The Sherpas said the rope was between them when they found her. It just snapped." She paused, her voice breaking on the last word. "They promised they'd never let go." That night, the news spread quietly across town. The recovery had made headlines everywhere else, but here in Golden, folks took it personally. At the coffee shop, the same table by the window sat empty, their old maps still pinned on the corkboard near the counter. Someone left a single white rose by the door, the petals already browning by morning. It felt like closure, but it didn't feel like peace. A few weeks later, Caroline invited me to her house for dinner. She had something she wanted me to see. When I arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a small waterproof bag, the kind climbers use to protect journals and maps. "This was in Emily's jacket," she said, sliding it across the table. Inside was the notebook I'd heard about, the one they'd found with her. The outer pages were brittle. The pencil smudged and faded, but on one line near the end, her handwriting was clear. "Storm too strong. James weak. We stay together always." I read it twice, then once more slower this time. It wasn't dramatic or poetic, it was just raw, honest, stripped down to survival and love. I realized then that what people called courage wasn't about defying the storm. It was about standing still in it, refusing to let go. For a while after that, Caroline and I tried to move on with the quiet parts of life-work errands, the slow rhythm of normal days. But the mountain lingered between us. Every so often a new article or photograph would surface. Reporters called their story a testament to love and endurance. But those of us who knew them saw something deeper. It wasn't just about love, it was about what love costs. Late that fall, a journalist from Denver reached out to me wanting to know if I'd heard about the newest debate among climbers, whether another expedition had found James and Emily years earlier, and kept silent. I told him I didn't know, though deep down I'd started to believe it. The official reports described the waterproof pouch on James's chest as recently disturbed. The term was vague, but it said enough. On Everest, every climber's decision ripples across others, sometimes with fatal silence. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. 2 years of waiting, 2 years of false hope, because maybe someone had chosen reputation over compassion. Caroline felt it too. "If they knew and didn't tell us," she said one night, "then we lost them twice." Her words hung heavy between us because there was no way to prove any of it. The mountain doesn't keep records, just evidence buried in shifting ice. Still, the questions wouldn't rest. Why had James's gear been found so neatly preserved? How could his identification have stayed so clean, untouched by years of snowdrift? It didn't add up. A part of me wondered if another team had stumbled across him in that first year, taken what they needed for proof or sponsorship, and left without saying a word. I didn't want to believe it, but I'd seen enough of human nature to know it wasn't impossible. By early 2007, the story of James and Emily had become legend among climbers. They were called the Guardian and the Dreamer, their photographs pinned on message boards. Their final image a grainy shot of two figures holding hands in the storm shared across magazines and documentaries. Every season, new climbers passed by their resting place on the North Corner. Some said they whispered a prayer. Others said they just looked away. Either way, no one walked by untouched. That summer, I joined Caroline at the memorial in Colorado. The town had gathered near the foothills, a quiet ceremony under clear skies. A brass plaque bore their names, and beneath it an engraving of Emily's final line, "We stay together always." As people began to leave, Caroline stayed behind, kneeling in the grass. "They didn't conquer the mountain," she said softly. "They just refused to let it take their love." I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to add. But in the months after new details began surfacing again, a Sherpa team reported finding items further down the slope, small fragments that might have belonged to Emily's gear. A ring, possibly James's grandmother's, and a carabiner with initials carved into the metal. None of it was confirmed publicly, but it reignited all the old questions. What else was still up there? What hadn't the ice yet revealed? Even now I think about those days when everything we learned seemed to open another wound instead of closing one. There was talk of a film crew heading to Everest to document their story, and Caroline agreed to an interview. She looked composed on camera, steady and calm, but I could see her fingers trembling when she read from Emily's notebook. The crew later sent her a copy of the documentary's final cut. She watched it alone. When I asked how it was, she said, "It's beautiful, but it doesn't feel like them. They made it about the mountain. It should have been about what they carried into it. In a way, I understood. Mountains don't care about human emotion. They just exist vast and unmoved. But stories like James and Emily's, those are the things that make the cold a little less cruel." Not long after that, Caroline helped start a foundation in their names. The Whitaker Foster Foundation, she called it, a small organization aimed at funding search efforts for missing climbers and improving communication systems on high-altitude expeditions. I helped where I could, mostly on logistics and safety protocols. It felt good to turn grief into something useful. Still, every meeting, every planning call came with an echo of what had been lost. Around that time, an old climbing friend sent me a message. He'd been near the North Col again that season and said something strange. The section where James's body had once been visible was now empty, covered again by ice. "He's gone," he wrote. "The mountain took him back." That line stayed with me longer than I expected. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be, these brief moments when the mountain lets us see what it's holding before swallowing it again. That winter, Caroline and I met for coffee like we always did around the holidays. The cafe was decorated with string lights, soft carols playing in the background. She brought a photo from Nepal, a shot of the recovery team standing in silence near the ridge where Emily had been found. The snow was pure white except for a single blue speck in the distance, barely visible but there. She traced it with her finger and whispered, "That's her jacket." We sat there a long time without speaking. Outside, the sky was turning that flat, heavy gray that comes before snow. The heater clicked softly beneath our table. Finally, Caroline looked up and said, "You know what the ranger told me?" He said her hand was still gripping the rope. It broke, but she never let go. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about those words, the rope, the break, the grip that didn't loosen even in death. I imagined the two of them in that final storm fighting for each other as the world went white around them. And I realized that maybe what we call tragedy is just love that lasted longer than the body could. For the rest of that year, the foundation grew slowly but surely. More climbers were rescued, more families got the answers Caroline once prayed for. Yet even as the work expanded, a strange quiet began following her. She started speaking at schools and outdoor clubs, telling their story not as a warning, but as a lesson. Courage doesn't mean control, she'd say. It means understanding what can't be controlled. Sometimes when she spoke those words, I could see the weight behind them. The mountain hadn't just taken her sister. It had reshaped how she saw everything that followed. I think it reshaped me too. In early 2008, I visited her home again. On the mantel above her fireplace sat 2 framed photographs, one of James and Emily on a trail in Colorado, the other a grainy print from Emily's recovered camera, the last image of them holding hands in the storm. I asked if it ever felt strange to look at that picture every day. She smiled faintly. "No," she said. "It reminds me that love doesn't stop just because life does." Later that evening, when I left her house, snow had started to fall, slow, gentle flakes drifting down through the porch light. For a moment, I stood there listening to the quiet. Somewhere far beyond those clouds, the same snow was falling over Everest. Maybe covering their tracks, maybe uncovering something new. Either way, it felt like the mountain was still breathing, still keeping watch. That's the thing about stories like theirs, they never really end. They just settle like snow over stone, waiting for the next gust of wind to stir them up again. And in that silence, you can almost hear what they left behind. Not words, not warnings, just a promise. The kind that holds even when the rope breaks. I still remember that last winter in Golden, the way the air felt thinner somehow, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The foundation had begun to grow by then, steady and quiet, like something that didn't need attention to keep living. Caroline ran most of it out of her home, surrounded by boxes of maps, grant forms, and handwritten letters from families who'd lost someone to the snow. She read every one. Sometimes I'd find her sitting in her kitchen long after midnight, a cup of tea gone cold beside her, whispering lines from those letters to herself. We finally found him. We brought her home. Words that once would have cut her open now seemed to give her a kind of peace. The town had changed in small ways too. That old coffee shop where James and Emily planned their climb now kept a framed photo of them on the back wall right above the booth they used to sit in. It wasn't much, just a picture of 2 people laughing into the wind, but it felt right. Locals would leave small things under it, a summit token, a folded note once, even a pair of gloves. Nobody said it was a shrine, but everyone treated it like one. Every spring around the time the ice started to break on Clear Creek, the foundation held a small memorial climb up Mount Everest. Not Everest, just our own mountain. Safer, gentler, but still enough to make your lungs burn and your mind quiet. Caroline would always hike near the front, her breath visible in the morning cold, a small silver pendant with Emily's initials hanging from her pack. Each year, she said the same thing to the new volunteers before we started. We climb not to conquer, but to remember. And then we'd begin boots crunching on frozen ground, the sound echoing up the canyon walls. By then, the story of James and Emily had taken on a life of its own. Documentaries came and went, magazines ran anniversary pieces, and filmmakers called from everywhere wanting interviews. Most of the time, Caroline declined. The story's already been told, she'd say. But every once in a while, she agreed to speak, always the same way, sitting by her fireplace, her voice low and steady. She never talked about the tragedy. She talked about preparation, about respect for nature, about how thin the line is between bravery and surrender. When she finished, she'd look into the camera and say, "My sister didn't fail. She just reached her limit." And that's something people need to understand. There was talk once of retrieving more personal items from the site, the rest of their gear, maybe that old ring James had meant to leave on the summit. But the rangers advised against it. Too risky, too unstable. Caroline didn't fight it. She said some things belonged to the mountain now. As for me, I stayed involved in small ways. The foundation needed someone to review rescue protocols, and I knew enough about emergency work to be useful. But truthfully, I think I stayed close because I didn't know how to let go. Even after all those years, I'd wake up some nights still hearing wind in my ears. That hollow, endless sound that could have been the Rockies or could have been Everest, it didn't matter. Mountains carry the same silence everywhere. By 2010, the Foundation had funded its 10th successful recovery mission overseas. Each one brought a family the closure that Caroline once fought so hard to find. I saw her name listed in an article once director of the Whitaker Foster Foundation, Golden, Colorado. It didn't mention Emily or James, just her title, her work, her impact. I thought that was fitting. The mountain had taken her sister, but it had also forged her into something unbreakable. That same year, a production crew released a documentary about the emotional toll of high-altitude loss. It closed with audio from an old tape Emily had recorded years earlier, her voice faint but clear. "When you climb, you're not escaping life. You're walking straight into it." The theater was quiet when it ended. People didn't clap. They just sat there listening to the silence that followed. A few months later, Caroline invited me to her home again. On the mantel above the fireplace, she'd added 2 new photos. One of a young Nepalese girl smiling in front of her family's rebuilt home, the other of a rescue team holding up a flag bearing the Foundation's emblem. "That's the first one we helped fund fully," she said. "Saved 3 climbers." She looked proud, but her eyes had that faraway glint again, the same one she'd had when she first stepped off the plane from Kathmandu years ago. I asked her if she ever planned to go back. She shook her head. "I don't need to," she said. "They're everywhere I go now. In the years since life has carried on the way life does, slowly, stubbornly. I see Caroline less often now. She moved out near Estes Park, closer to the mountains, but far enough to feel safe. Every Christmas, she still sends me a card with a photo of a sunrise, never a sunset. Always a sunrise and a short line from Emily's notebook printed beneath it. We stay together always. It's strange how those words have changed meaning over time. Back then, they were a record of tragedy. Now they feel like a kind of grace. Sometimes I visit their graves. The cemetery sits on a hill that overlooks the town with a view that stretches all the way to the ridge where the horizon lifts into snow. Their markers are simple. No quotes, no engravings beyond their names and dates, but the space between them is small, no more than a foot. When the wind blows, the grass around them bends together, as if even now they're refusing to drift apart. Standing there, I often think about the choices they made. To climb when the storm was coming. To keep going when turning back meant life. It's easy for people to call it reckless, but I've learned that love makes you believe in your own endurance. They weren't chasing fame or glory. They were chasing each other. And when the mountain turned against them, they faced it the only way they knew how together. The mountain still takes people every year. Every season brings new names, new faces, the same heartbreak wrapped in different years. But because of the Foundation, fewer of those stories end in silence now. Families get the call. Loved ones get to say goodbye. Caroline once told me that every time someone is found, she feels like Emily is guiding them home. I don't know if I believe in things like that, but I like to think she's right. On clear nights, when the air over Golden is thin and the stars are sharp enough to hurt your eyes, I sometimes drive up to Lookout Point. From there, the town looks like a scatter of gold dust across the valley. It's quiet up there, just wind crickets, the hum of faraway traffic. I'll stand at the railing, breathe the cold in, and think about them, about how small and fragile life looks from high places, and how much love it takes to keep walking forward when the sky feels like it's pressing down on you. People ask me sometimes why I still tell their story after all these years. The truth is, it's not just theirs anymore. It belongs to everyone who's ever waited for a knock on the door, every family who's watched the snow fall and wondered if someone they love was under it. Remembering them keeps us connected to each other, to the ones we lost, to the world that keeps turning even when we're not ready for it to. Before I leave the cemetery, each visit I always touch the corner of Emily's stone and whisper a small promise that we haven't forgotten that the light's still burning back home. And when the wind picks up rustling through the grass, it almost feels like she's answering. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because sometimes the only thing stronger than the silence of a mountain is the sound of a voice that refuses to let it fade.